Hello and welcome to the 5th episode of Novel Approaches, a close reading series for the London Review of Books. I'm Clare Bucknell, I'm a Fellow of All Souls College, Oxford, and a writer for the paper, and I'll be your host today as we discuss North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell, which was published in book form in 1855, and it was published serially in Charles Dickens's Household Words before that. And to talk about North and South, I'm really delighted to be joined by Dinah Birch, who is a Emeritus Professor of English at Liverpool University. Dinah has long been a regular contributor to the LRB and written on all sorts of subjects for the paper, including Elizabeth Gaskell. And she has also published widely on 19th century literature, books and articles on Ruskin, Trollope, George Eliot, and Victorian education. And she is the editor of Gaskell's novel Cranford. Hi, Dinah. Thank you for being here.
Hello. It's a pleasure to be here.
I wonder if we could begin at the beginning. Who was Elizabeth Gaskell? What was her family background?
She was a writer with 6 novels to her name and, in fact, many short stories. She was born in 1810 and died in 1865, so only 55 when she died. She lost her mother as a baby. She was just about a year old, but she was supported by a fairly well-to-do extended family. She was sent to live with her mother's sister, Hannah Lum, who lived in Knutsford, and Hannah took responsibility for Elizabeth in her early years. Her father remarried and had further children and seems to have been quite distant from his 2 older children. Elizabeth had a brother, John. There wasn't a great shortage of money. They weren't wealthy, Hannah and her family, but they weren't poor. And Elizabeth was well educated. As she grew older, her father took an interest in her education. She was sent to a good school run by the Byerley sisters in Stratford-on-Avon, and rather unusually for a 19th century novelist, she was happy at school and successful. She was popular, her teachers liked her, she liked her fellow pupils. It wasn't the most demanding education, but it wasn't a trivial education. She learned about history, geography, to some extent mathematics, not to any very great extent, and she felt like an educated woman by the time she left. Of course, no question of university. She was a woman and indeed a nonconformist because her background was Unitarian. And that's a very important fact about her early life and indeed her later life and her life as a novelist. She married William Gaskell, who was a Unitarian minister based in the north of England, where indeed she had roots. Her father was Scottish. She lived in Manchester as a very active minister's wife and a dedicated mother. She had 4 surviving children, all girls, 4 daughters. She had a son, Willie, who died in infancy, which was a great sorrow to her. She was well connected in Unitarian circles, but also in other circles. She was a very sociable woman throughout her life, always, and a very active woman. A happy marriage, again, rather unusually for a 19th century novelist. And William, who deserves a mention, was throughout his life, and he long outlived her, very devoted to Elizabeth and very supportive of her writing, never resented the life that she had outside the household. That, I think, was partly a tribute to his generous nature. He was a generous man. But it was also a feature of Unitarianism that women were taken seriously, not just as mothers and wives and sisters, though that was obviously an important part of their work in the world, those domestic duties, but work outside the family unit was something that mattered and something that Elizabeth Gaskell never felt guilty about taking on. She sometimes felt it to be a strain. Well, she was not unique in that, but she certainly thought that it was a responsibility to use her talents. And one of the reasons that she felt that, and one of the reasons for her being throughout her life such a serious writer, was that Unitarianism hugely valued education. And she saw her writing as a means of introducing people to ideas and indeed ideals that were important to her. But I think it should also be said that she was hard-headed, practical, down to earth, and she was very pleased to earn some money. She was not oblivious to the pleasures of an income of her own, an independent income. She was spirited as a girl, determined as a woman, and as you can tell from her letters, with a keen sense of humour, a sense of the absurd, which never left her, never given to self-importance, although I should also say she knew her own value and she knew her own place in the world, and she was not going to be pushed around by anyone, really, but certainly not by people she met in her career as a writer. And here I'm thinking perhaps particularly of Dickens.
Let's pause and come back to Dickens, because I just want to push you on something you were saying earlier about Unitarianism. So this non-conformist strand within Christianity that was so central to her life and to her husband's, and I think also to her fiction. But what was Unitarianism in the mid-19th century, and what sort of version of it or what strands within it did she espouse?
It's such an interesting faith, Unitarianism. It's not dead. There are still many active Unitarians. It had its origins in Europe in the 16th century, in fact, and spread over the decades, over the centuries, and reached England and Scotland at the end of the 18th century in a form that became very influential. So a name that many people will associate with Unitarianism in terms of its history is Joseph Priestley, who was a hugely important public figure, an intellectual in that period. He was an influential, very significant scientist. He was the first man to isolate oxygen, but he was also a theologian and a Unitarian. And he didn't invent exactly, didn't establish, but settled the main outlines of the faith. So Unitarians were thought to be bold in their religious thinking in that they rejected the Trinity, the doctrine of the Trinity. They rejected the doctrine of eternal damnation. They would never have any truck with that. They believed in a benevolent God. And most controversially, they rejected the idea of Christ as a divine figure, the divinity of Christ. They thought that he was an example of a perfect human life, but not divine. Mm-hmm. I say they thought that, but one of the rather engaging things about Unitarians is that they were rather prone to thinking different things at different moments in their history. They were very disputatious, and Unitarianism was never, in fact, a fixed faith. Never was there a group of people more given to argument and ideas and controversies. They seemed to love to argue, and they did so constantly. And so different Unitarians would take slightly different positions. So Elizabeth Gaskell, for instance, was rather inclined to accept a version of the divinity of Christ, for instance, whereas others didn't. The fact that, on the whole, Unitarians didn't accept the divinity of Christ rather pushed them to the edge of the family of Christian sects, and I suppose that is the term really, certainly nonconformism. Many nonconformists, though they had removed themselves from Anglican orthodoxy, were very hostile to the notion of a faith that called itself Christian but didn't accept the divinity of Christ. They were really not Christian at all. And for that reason, and here is a kind of tension which I think does play out in Elizabeth Gaskell's life, they were always very concerned to be, as it were, respectable.
Right.
Not to be radical rebels, to be supportive of central institutions, though often very sceptical of their authority. It's quite complex. And this burden of respectability, I think, did fall particularly heavily on the shoulders of women. Mm-hmm. So Unitarian women were very anxious not to be seen as disruptive, as people who are going to overthrow the social or cultural status quo. Elizabeth Gaskell did feel that, though she herself never saw herself as altogether part of that establishment. There are these tensions that are very common among Unitarians, and you see them reflected in Elizabeth Gaskell's life and work. But there is an important point to make about Unitarianism, which I think was crucial to Elizabeth Gaskell. They really believed in work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
In the broader sense, not necessarily money-making, though certainly it was often money-making, and many Unitarian families did become wealthy. And in fact, Elizabeth Gaskell's mother's side of the family were very successful commercial people, and indeed successful socially too. But the notion that you would sit around and do nothing, whether you were a man or a woman, was not acceptable. You would show your worth in the world by work, and it needed to be socially responsible work. Whether you were making money or not, you needed to be exercising a kind of outward-facing charity, which was very important to Elizabeth Gaskell and to other women of the period. It's not unique to Elizabeth Gaskell or indeed to Unitarianism, but it was very strong within Unitarianism. You had a responsibility, and Elizabeth Gaskell felt that.
Yes, I can completely see how that works its way through the novel, and in particular the main character who we'll come to. So let's get into Gaskell's writing. So what else had she written before she began North and South?
So there are 6 novels in all. She began with some rather kind of high-minded and didactic short stories. So she'd been writing for a while. I mentioned the little boy, Willie, who died of scarlet fever quite unexpectedly, and Elizabeth Gaskell was devastated by that. And her husband, William, devoted as ever, was anxious about her. It took her a long time to get over it. And he suggested that she should try to write something longer, a novel. And so she wrote Mary Barton, published in 1848. It was a novel about the industrial context of her life in Manchester, and we might go on to talk about that. But it was also a novel overshadowed, I think, by her sense of sorrow and grief and loss. It's a powerful novel, a disturbing novel, still packs a punch, about loss, really. Well, about all sorts of things, but certainly about that. She regretted later that she had not been able, at the time she wrote it, to give it, as she put it, a little more hope. However, the next novel, which isn't in a way quite a novel, is Cranford. And that resulted from a series of papers that she wrote based on her childhood and early years in Knutsford with her aunt. And that is much more upbeat and often indeed very funny. It does have strands of sadness. All her writing actually has that. But nevertheless, it's a much more cheering novel. And it's had great success. It published as a kind of group of papers, and we do now think of it as a novel. It wasn't planned as a novel. In 1852, then we have Ruth. Now, Ruth was a very bold novel which rehabilitates or attempts to rehabilitate the life and the value of the life of a woman who falls from sexual purity and has an illegitimate child, a son, and redeems herself by, again, work and by her sense of her own value and her own place in the world, but ends, as it has to be said, Elizabeth Gaskell is rather prone to do, by a death.
Yes.
Ruth dies at the end of the novel, and then comes along North and South. So that is the fourth of the major outputs, but obviously we'll say more about that. An industrial novel, but not such a bleak one as Mary Barton.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. So Mary Barton, her first industrial novel set in Manchester, taking for its subject, as North and South does, the fraught relationship between employer and employees, masters and hands. But it's also this no-holds-barred portrait of urban poverty, illness, as you said, death and loss. So I'm interested, how was Mary Barton received, within the predominantly middle-class community Gaskell moved in Manchester? The sort of antagonistic novel which pits classes against one another and, really scrutinises the working relationship with sort of this clear-eyed way.
Not only scrutinises it, but makes it very clear that the suffering of the workers in Manchester was in large part due to the behaviour of the factory-owning, mill-owning capitalists. So it's hardly surprising that people that she knew who were in that category, people that she lived with and worked alongside, were not best pleased.
Not thrilled.
No. Well, their argument was, firstly, that she had entirely ignored their efforts to relieve the sufferings of the poor, which was to some extent true, though their efforts were not perhaps very effective nor very widespread, but nevertheless, and also that she had no understanding of the laws of political economy. Mm-hmm. I mean, she tried to diffuse their anger by saying, oh, well, obviously I don't really understand how these things work. But of course, that immediately made things worse. So there was quite a fuss. But of course, it did nothing to hurt the success of the novel.
Yeah.
A controversy is always helpful. And these things died down. They did then, they do now. So things kind of calmed down and settled. Again, William, her husband William, really came up trumps because he was dealing with the sharp end of this because he somehow allowed his wife to write this dreadful novel, and how awful was that? But he was completely unperturbed, absolutely stood by her. She did publish it anonymously because she knew it was going to be trouble. And she did rather dread that, though she had no thought of flinching. She was a woman of some courage, I think. Mm-hmm. But of course, it was soon out. The secret was soon out who it was. So that was no kind of defence. She did feel that she had perhaps, because, as we mentioned earlier, she was writing it at a dark time. Mm. She did come to feel that perhaps she had overdone it a little. And it is certainly true that the depictions of levels of sorrow and different kinds of grief in Mary Barton and the graphic pictures of the suffering of the poor is still unforgettable. I think one thing worth mentioning here is that unlike others who were writing about these issues, industrialisation and its problems, she knew what she was talking about.
She'd actually seen it.
She'd seen it at close hand over a period of years, not just a visit. She really knew the people who were involved. And she combines that knowledge with her analysis of the roots of the problems. She combines it with, and this is where I think her being a woman writer who had undertaken the kind of charitable work thought appropriate to women, it really supports her writer's ambitions. She knew the domestic detail, what it was like in their houses, in their cellars where some were living, what it was like not to be able to feed and clothe your family, not to be able to keep them warm in winter, and the resulting despair. And she wrote about it with a kind of depth of sympathy and emotion that other novelists, although they're not unfeeling novels that look at these issues, I don't think have quite the same power because they don't have that particularity of observation.
Yeah, we mentioned Dickens.
Yes.
Speaking of, so she published with Dickens in Household Words. As you are suggesting, that there's a distinction between the levels of knowledge and intimacy they brought to their novels. I think I'm right in describing their author-editor relationship as not perfect.
No, it wasn't perfect. But she knew that she owed Dickens, that without Dickens' patronage, she would never have had the success and the wide readership that she was able to achieve. And she wasn't ungrateful, nor was Dickens unappreciative of what Gaskell brought to Household Words. And he called his periodical Household Words. He wanted that focus on the family, on the household, on the home. And Elizabeth Gaskell brought that in the short stories, because she was publishing short stories with him, not just the serialised novel. He was seriously impressed by what seemed to him her powerful and original approach, and, the fact that from his perspective, she had the right values. So there was a lot of mutual respect. I think the problem was Dickens wanted control. He wanted to control his periodical, and you can see why. It's not easy editing a journal. Anyone who's had that experience will confirm. And contributors can be very unruly. So he did try to exercise control over all his contributors, and certainly tried to manage Elizabeth Gaskell's work with very limited success, because she wouldn't be managed.
She wouldn't be managed?
No, not really. That's not quite true. There were concessions that she made. And she acknowledged sometimes she made mistakes. She found serialisation hard. It wasn't her natural medium. And she tended to find pacing the writing quite challenging. And you do see that, I think, with North and South, particularly if you look at the novel as it was originally published in parts, that she'd simply run out of space. And as she freely confessed, that was really her fault, because she had been told what space she had, but she was running out of her word count, as it were, and she hadn't finished the story. So it does get very rushed at the end.
It does pick up at the end, doesn't it? Yes,
it really does.
Yes.
Not so bad in the 1855 volume edition, but certainly in the parts edition, it's a terrific gallop. And we might talk about the extent to which you might say that's a problem. It's not altogether a problem, I think.
If you're listening on the LRB podcast or on the free version of Close Readings, then I'm afraid we're going to have to leave you there. But if you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear the rest of it, and trust me, there's a lot more of it, you can do that right now by subscribing to Close Readings. And that will give you access to all our other Close Readings series as well, covering literature from ancient Greece to the present day. And you can find details of how to do that in the description or go directly to lrb.me/audio. That's lrb.me/audio.